I am California of the past.
I am California of the past.
I
I am California of the past.
My name is Pat Barquette, and I'm a volunteer here with the Belmont Library for maybe the last decade. And before that, I was a flight attendant for United Airlines for 42 years. Shortly after I started flying, and it seems like a short time to me now, in 1968 I started flying in '63. I was the first of a United Airlines flight that was hijacked, and by far the first that was hijacked not from the East Coast, Miami or New York, or maybe Carolinas. This was the longest term hijacking because we were hijacked out of Los Angeles. So we took off from Los Angeles. The seatbelts, of course, there was smoking then, so the no smoking sign went off, and then even before the seatbelt sign went off, these two guys were coming up the aisle. And I'm thinking that the guy in front was sort of pale, ashen looking, and I thought he was ill. And he was assisted by a guy behind him who I thought was assisting him to the bathrooms, which were just in front of me. But they bypassed the bathrooms and they came right up to me. And I remember the passenger who was being used as a hostage said, "Open the cockpit door." And I remember just very casually saying, "Why?" And he said, "Because he's got a gun." So I unfastened my seatbelt, got up from my jump seat, and sure enough, he had a gun right against the guy's jugular vein. So I just rapped on the cockpit door because in those days, I smoked, a lot of my friends smoked, the pilots smoked, and they just assumed I was knocking on the door for a pre-service cigarette. And as soon as the door opened, the hijacker pushed, I still remember his name, Mr. DeFreitas and myself into the cockpit. And once we got all of us into the cockpit, then he transferred the gun from the passenger's neck to the back of the captain's head, and he left it there for most of the trip. And then he made the passenger and myself go back into the cabin. So there was a hierarchy. There's always a top flight attendant, and then I was the second flight attendant working first class, and then there were 4 girls in the back. So the first flight attendant said, "Well, what should we do?" And I said, "Well, I don't think we should do anything until we really know what's happening." And we were sort of thinking we went to Cuba. We were going to Cuba, but this is out of the West Coast. We've been going someplace else. So sure enough, maybe 15 minutes later, the captain, this was his last trip before he retired, he made an announcement and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been diverted to the Jose Martin Airport in Cuba. And because flight time from Los Angeles to New York City, it was called Idlewild then, I think, from Los Angeles to Cuba was like 6 minutes difference in flight time. There was never any question about running out of fuel or having to land somewhere. We could just divert and go to Cuba, which is what we did." And people have said, "Well, were you afraid?" And I said, "No, I never really was afraid." And this was a hijacker that just stayed in the cockpit. And we did find out who this hijacker was later, and I'll get into that later. But during the flight, we had all of these high-powered marketing officials on board, and United had no policy on hijackings. This was the first flight they had hijacked. So 6 hours go by, and we land in Cuba, and it's in July, and it's at midnight. So I open the door, I'm right next to the door, and maybe 5 or 6 Cuban military men in khaki outfits come up, and we're not used to landing in an airport that's surrounded by rolls of barbed wire. So it was definitely a different experience. And then I asked in my very limited high school Spanish, "¿Cuántos tiempos aquí?" And they said, "Just long enough to get the hijacker's bag." He checked a bag off the airplane. And in order to do this, they had to offload all the bags manually. If this was in a U.S. airport, they would have a special tool and the whole big module would come down and would go into the baggage claim. But they had to do each bag individually. So that took quite a while. And while they were doing that, they had the captain and us 6 flight attendants that they ushered off into sort of a nice waiting area and gave us Cuban cigars and coffee and sandwiches. Then they took the passengers and put them in a huge non-air conditioned waiting room, and they just waited there. So now it's maybe 2 o'clock in the morning, and they put all the bags back in the airplane except for the hijackers. They couldn't find his bag because United had lost it. There wasn't any communication once those guys got off the plane. That was it. So we're ready to leave, and then a higher group of Cuban officials came and said, "We understand, Captain Nyber, that you refused to relinquish the hijacker's bag." And the captain said, "No, I'm just really sorry, but somehow the bag never got to the airplane. Maybe he checked in late." And they said, "We don't believe you." So they made the poor first officer and the engineer, the navigator, at that time we still had a navigator that had a little window on top of the DC-8, and he navigated with the stars. The navigator and the co-pilot had to do the whole thing all over again. And then it's like 3 o'clock in the morning, and the pilots just said, "We are not flying any farther," even though it's only 90 miles from Cuba to Miami, because that's where we would have gone into. We did go into. So they bused us to one of the last luxury hotels built before the revolution, but it's been several years now since this has happened. So there were like weeds in the swimming pool and that really musty odor that an enclosed building would get in without any air conditioning. But we stayed there, and we all had breakfast in the morning, and we happily went back to Miami the next day. And through it all, as I said before, I wasn't at all afraid. However, I'd say one of the girls on the back witch, she never flew again. One of the girls moved here and was very hesitant to talk about it. And I remember, I was married at the time, and they called my husband, who must have been on a business trip, so they called my mom. Little Swedish lady with braids over her head, living on the banks of the Mississippi in northern Minnesota. And my mom said to United, whoever from Human Resources called her, she said, "Well, what do you want me to do about it?" So that was it. That was the end of the story. And since then, there of course were hijackings where people were killed, or not to mention the escalation with the horrible flights that happened later, September 11th. But there were a lot of hijackings, and ours was just the first that was such a long distance hijacking. And it seems hard, it's hard for me to believe that I ever even flew, much less that I was hijacked to Cuba in the 60s. So that's the end of my story.